Not too many artists in history are as brilliant yet deranged as Caravaggio. On the one hand, his art broke all the conventional rules, seriously pissed off the church, and was so groundbreaking it brought 17th century Rome to a standstill. But on the other hand, he was an aggressive, cocky criminal who attacked civilians, police officers, knights, got arrested a bunch of times, escaped from prison, was convicted of murder, and had a bounty placed on his head. So let's try to understand the strange duality that we see within Caravaggio, a guy who lived a violent and unhinged life, but still somehow, someway managed to create some of the most beautiful and graceful art that you're ever gonna see. So it's 1599 and a 27-year-old Caravaggio was on the verge of making history. He just landed his first major commission, which was to paint the altar wall of a really big chapel. Now, at this point in his career, he'd only mainly done work for private collectors, so he was still relatively unknown on the wider scene, so this was the first time his work could actually be displayed right in public, so he had to lock in. And within a year, the work was complete. When it was unveiled, let's just say Caravaggio became the largest overnight sensation in the Roman art world. So the commission had called for a series of two religious paintings, the Calling of Matthew and the Martyrdom of Matthew. And to really understand why these works are so groundbreaking, let's have a look at the Calling. One of the first things that sets it apart is just how normal it is. See, typically religious scenes like this were depicted in this idealized and sacred fashion, but Caravaggio tosses these norms aside. There's no pretty clouds in the sky, there's no angels playing harps or anything. It's just a bleak, dark setting in an everyday tavern that the common folk could relate to. Heck, he went as far as getting random people off the street to use as his models for these works. Which leads me into a second thing that stands out, perhaps even more so. The chiaroscuro, a motive painting that involves sharp contrast between light and shadow. In its extreme form, it's known as tenebrism. Caravaggio takes this thing to an entirely new level where, against an almost pitch black background, his figures are illuminated by a single strong light source, which makes them pop and emphasizes their three-dimensionality. So this masterful execution of tenebrism, plus his down-to-earth portrayal of these scenes, combined for a unique style of painting that was like nothing else during this time period. So these two works really were the beginning, in a sense, the catalyst, which led to him getting more prominent commissions down the road, and so things were looking up for Caravaggio, but unfortunately, good things never last, not even for him. See, the thing with Caravaggio is that he's annoying. Unlike other artists of this time, he left behind nothing. No drawings, no sketchbooks, no journals, nothing. We have nothing from Caravaggio himself other than his paintings. So a rare instance where we actually hear from Caravaggio's mouth is in some trial records where when he was asked about what makes a good painting, Caravaggio casually answers, "A good painter is someone who can imitate nature well." Now, have a look at these two paintings and guess what they have in common. They were both rejected by the church who commissioned them. Take this, right? So this is the inspiration of Matthew, which was done shortly and separately from the previous two Matthews. It depicts the disciple as some shabby, near illiterate old dude who's struggling to write down his own divine revelation and requires his hand to be guided by an angel, which is a depiction that was seen as disrespectful and completely unacceptable to the church. So he had to redo it, and the remake was obviously accepted. But what this does, it gives us a unique insight into how Caravaggio approaches art. He depicts these deified and idealized characters as regular, everyday people. He'd go out and grab anyone, the sick, the homeless, the poor, the drunks, off the streets to model as these sacred biblical heroes. Heck, everyone knows how much the Catholics revere Mary as the literal mother of God, and Caravaggio goes ahead and uses a prostitute's body as his model for her, which led to the painting obviously being taken down. This radical realism, in a sense, this aversion to idealization, is something that we've seen even in his earlier work. For example, a boy gracefully carries out a basket of fruit. But if you look a bit closer, the leaves are drying up. Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, on the surface it looks like he's elegantly holding out a glass of wine to us, but look a bit closer and his nails are dirty. And the fruits are going bad. The Supper at Emmaus, which is one of Caravaggio's masterpieces, the storyline here is that the disciples are having dinner with a man and they just realize that the guy that they're having dinner with is the resurrected Jesus himself. So it's this dramatic scene of realization, but then you just look closer and the bowl of fruits on the table are hanging on the edge, which just makes you want to go in there and just balance it properly. And of course, the fruits themselves are going bad. And pretty much anything he did containing fruits, he couldn't help but add a bit of blemish, a bit of imperfection. The leaves drying out, the apples going bad, because nature itself is imperfect, and Caravaggio sought to imitate it in all its beauty, but also in all its imperfections, as opposed to just an idealized version of it. Because a good painter is someone who can imitate nature well. If you're curious, by the way, about why this other painting was rejected, the reason is a little bit unclear, but it's might be because it shows the Apostle Paul fighting against the light, in a sense, as opposed to embracing it. The remake he did was a lot more acceptable and pleasing to the church. It's kind of funny because anytime he had a painting get rejected, private collectors would rush to snap them up because they're just cool pieces of art, bro. Now, perhaps these rejections kind of got to him because around about this time, the erraticness that Caravaggio was known for really begins to take off. Erraticness that would gradually lead to his fall from grace. And of course, while you right now don't have to worry about protecting yourself from psychos like Caravaggio, at least not as much as they did back then, you do have to protect yourself against the dangers of the internet, which leads me into today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Now, the way Surfshark VPN works is kind of like taking your data and putting it in a box before sending it over the internet. And so you can imagine some scenario where you're in the public Wi-Fi spot, like a restaurant or an airport or something. Even in the event that some hacker hacks into the network, which they'll probably be able to do pretty easily if they wanted to, since your data is already protected inside Surfshark's secure little box, said hacker isn't going to be able to look around and peep into what you're doing, which is pretty cool. Additionally, with Surfshark, you can switch up your internet location and be able to access content or websites that have been banned or blocked in whatever country you're in. And genuinely, Surfshark is more than just a VPN. It offers additional security features like antivirus software, which protects you from viruses, malware, and ad tracking while you're browsing the internet. And with their 30-day money-back guarantee, plus with the fact that you can secure unlimited devices on just one plan, there's literally zero risk involved and all the reward to be gained when you do choose to try it out. So head over to surfshark.com/goblish, which I'll stick in the description or in the pinned comment, or just go ahead and use code goblish at checkout to get an extra 4 months free of Surfshark VPN. So yeah, shout out Surfshark, bro. Where were we? Yes, Caravaggio's erraticness. Now in 1604, and Caravaggio was on the top of the world. He'd swagger about Rome with his cronies, brimming with arrogance, flashing the sword at his hip, even though civilians weren't allowed to carry weapons. But this guy and rules didn't necessarily have the greatest relationship of all time. Having constant run-ins with the law, whether it was for attacking a waiter, throwing rocks at police, throwing rocks at the landlady's house because she evicted him because he hadn't paid his rent for months, or even worse, writing and distributing diss poems with his cronies against a painter that he didn't like, which actually aren't even that bad, bro. And just not to mention all the times he'd get arrested for carrying his weapon illegally or attacking some random person on the street for some random reasons. And whenever he'd get arrested for any of these transgressions, his powerful connections would just intervene and get him out. But somehow, someway, despite all of this drama, he remained the biggest painter in Rome and would paint some of his best works in around these years. For instance, one of my favorite Caravaggios is the Crucifixion of Peter, where the story goes that Peter didn't see himself fit to die in the same manner as Jesus, so he requested to be crucified upside down. But what really stands out to me here is that's the indifference that we see in the executioners. They're literally killing a man in one of the most gruesome ways possible. Peter is clearly in pain and agony, but to them, this is just a job. There's no emotion here, there's no animosity, there's no hatred. To them, it's just a task that they need to get over with. The series of paintings that Caravaggio was hitting in these early 1600s were just impeccable. And it was in around 1604 where he did the Entombment of Christ, a painting depicting the moment Jesus is getting buried, and it was praised at his finest actually at the time. And it's just insane how one day he's attacking some dude with a sword for no reason, and the next day he's painting religious scenes so much better than any of his contemporaries. But it would appear that karma was keeping its eye on him, because Caravaggio's time as the most sought after painter in all of Rome was about to come to an end. It's the fateful evening of May 28th, 1606. Caravaggio was standing on a tennis court. Across from him, his opponent, a guy named Tomasoni. But this was no tennis game. No. They were here to have a duel. See, Tomasoni was a pimp, And Caravaggio was a man who was familiar with the dark underbellies of Rome, the criminals, the miscreants, the prostitutes. I mean, these were the people he'd use as his models for his religious paintings. And funnily enough, Caravaggio was the kind of guy who was more than willing to defend the honor of prostitutes on the streets whenever he saw them getting disrespected. So maybe something around that was maybe the cause of his feud with Tomassoni. Long story short though, Caravaggio wins the duel. He inflicts a gruesome injury on Tomassoni's thigh, which causes him to bleed to death soon after. But here's the thing. Dueling was very illegal in Rome at the time, and it seems that it was only after the fact that common sense at long last finally had the grace to touch Caravaggio with its ever elusive hands, because he seems to actually realize the gravity of the situation, because Tomassoni was a guy who had connections in powerful places in Rome. So this isn't some situation that would simply get swept under the rug, so Caravaggio had to go on the run, and it's a good thing that he did, because soon after a trial was held in his absence where he was found guilty of murder. The punishment? Anyone who saw him was free to kill him and bring his corpse or his head as a reward. And now Caravaggio, once one of the most respected names in all of Rome, was a fugitive wanted for murder. One hell of a pickle he is in, Caravaggio. How's he gonna dig himself out of this one? So Caravaggio has one goal in mind at this point. A pardon. If he could get a pardon, he could return to Rome, no problem, and continue with his career. So he needed his powerful connections back in Rome to start negotiating to get him a pardon. But the problem is, Tomassoni, the guy he killed, also had his fair share of powerful connections who were trying actively to block Caravaggio's pardon. So Caravaggio had to remain on the run. And his time in effective exile is actually kind of interesting. One of the places he runs to is Malta, where, funnily enough, he becomes a knight, which actually granted him an automatic pardon for his crime. So he was a free man. And he even went ahead and did his largest ever painting, the beheading of John the Baptist, during this time, which is received splendidly. And it was like, oh, great. But then he goes ahead and attacks a senior knight with a sword, which lands him in prison. And then he just goes ahead and somehow escapes prison by scaling the walls and just running away. So he's lost his knighthood and he's lost his pardon, and now he's on the run from not only Rome but also the knights. This time he runs to Sicily, a place that didn't know about all this drama that was going on, so Caravaggio had no problem receiving a lucrative commission, which of course blows the locals away. But again, he's on the run. He can't stay in one spot for more than just a few months at a time, so he leaves again and had to keep moving from place to place. And everywhere he'd go, he'd receive one or two lucrative commissions, execute them to utter perfection, leave the locals in awe, and then just disappear. And maybe perhaps he liked oro farming like this. Being the new genius artist in town, comes in, blows everyone away, and then just disappears. In 1609, while he was in Naples, Caravaggio was dead. Or at least that's what people thought. One day, a mysterious band of men, out of nowhere, just attacked Caravaggio so grievously and left him in such critical condition that people literally thought he died. But no, he survived this time and had to spend some time just relaxing and recovering. And what does he do in recovery? He paints. These are some of Caravaggio's bleakest and darkest works, revolving around the theme of death. They're all relatively small and easy to transport paintings, which he was probably making with the hope of taking them back to Rome as like a thank you gift should the negotiations for his pardon be successful. And out of all of these, to me at least, David carrying the head of Goliath stands out. Caravaggio goes ahead and paints his own portrait as the severed head of Goliath, as if to say, hey, you wanted my head? Here it is. So at some point in early 2010, it seems like negotiations for his pardon were going pretty good, because Caravaggio sets off to Rome by ship with all his thank you paintings in hand. Hopefully he could go in there, give his paintings in, get pardoned, and continue with his career, and just finally calm down. And so things at long last were looking pretty hopeful for him. But good things, of course, never last, especially not for him. Along the way, the ship made a stop and Caravaggio got arrested. This time, though, it was different because it seems it was a case of mistaken identity, because he was soon after released. But by the time that they did that, the ship had already left, which was tragic because all his paintings were on board. The paintings that he absolutely needed, those paintings. So he hoped to catch up to the ship by foot at its next stop, which was going to be 60 miles away. In 2010, an archaeologist uncovered a document which gave a possible hint to Caravaggio's burial spot. So he got together a team of forensic analysts and archaeologists and scoured the region for remains and produced 9 sets of skeletons, one of which matched Caravaggio's description and time span almost perfectly. They were 85% sure that it was him. On July 18th, as he was on the way trying to catch up to the ship by foot, which had all his paintings, perhaps due to a fever or a sunstroke or a combination of all those, Caravaggio died. When news of his death reached his powerful supporters back in Rome, they scrambled to try and get a hold of those lost paintings. Caravaggio's body was buried in an unmarked grave.